Good morning. In Kinyarwanda, we would say Mwaramutse. See if anyone tried it. I just want to start by thanking you all for having me this morning. As the pastor said, my name is Laura Hermans, and I did recently return from a year of service in the country of Rwanda with the ELCA's Young Adults in Global Mission program. We call it YAGM for short. So YAGM is a program of the ELCA that sends 21 to 29-year-olds out into the world to walk alongside and serve our Lutheran partners in 13 different countries. But the real beauty of a YAGM experience is that it doesn't end when we leave that country. It doesn't end when we get on the plane back to the U.S. We as volunteers are tasked with bringing our year back with us, with bringing home our new perspectives, with bringing home our friendships that we made and the lessons that we learned. And that's where I think the real work begins. So now we have over 700 alumni of the program that are doing great work, like leading congregations, advocating for human rights, campaigning for racial justice, and empowering communities all over our own country. And so that's what brings me here today. First, to say thank you. Thank you for including YAGM in your benevolence, and thank you for supporting the ministry, my ministry, and the ministry of all the young adults in Global Mission that will be serving. So before I left to Rwanda last year, I decided I wanted to write a blog during the year as a way to share stories with people back in the U.S., and also as a way to kind of process this whole experience of living in a foreign country. And so I decided that before I left, I should write a few blog posts just to get comfortable with sharing all my thoughts on the internet. So my first blog post I wrote just after I moved out of my apartment in Milwaukee last August. And in this blog post, I talked about how in our lives, different cities or places sometimes have a lesson to teach us or signify a certain point in our life. So for me, Madison, Wisconsin, where I went to school, was all about learning. It was learning about myself and the world and my place in it. Then after I graduated, my tiny studio apartment in Milwaukee forced me out of my comfort zone and taught me how to live. So before I left to Rwanda, I was wondering what my next city would have to teach me. What would Butare, Rwanda have to teach me? So now I get to come back just over a year later with some answers. And it turns out Butare had a lot to teach me. Some unexpected things like how to teach an English class on a Saturday night during a thunderstorm with no power, how to cut tropical fruit without a cutting board, how to hail a motorcycle taxi, and how to carefully slip under a mosquito net without letting any bugs in. But the most real and important thing that Butare had to teach me was about love. The love that we read about in 1 John this morning. I want to read verse 11 again. It says, "Beloved, since God loved us so much, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is perfected in us." And I chose this passage to talk about because I really witnessed the universality of its message in my travels, even in language. In Swahili, for instance, there is a saying that says, "Palipo na upendo Mungu yupo." Where there is love, there is God. And in Kinyarwanda, the local language of Rwanda, there's a proverb that says, "Idini yukuri nurukundo." True religion is love. So I discovered this real love in Butare, Rwanda. But the thing is that it was not easy. And I would argue that real love rarely is. Butare taught me three important things about love. First, that it starts with a conscious decision. Second, it's followed by action. And third, it's received as much as it is given. Now, it didn't take me long to start learning these lessons. My year began with 3 weeks of orientation in country with the 4 fellow volunteers that would be serving alongside me. Now, I hadn't really worried too much about this part of the year. I figured we had this great group. We're all young, adventurous Lutherans. You know, how hard could it really be? But it turned out we were pretty different. So those first few weeks were this sometimes awkward, sometimes frustrating attempt to figure each other out before we all headed off to our separate work sites. But the amazing thing that I realized is that we all kept trying. We woke up each morning and kept pushing through that awkward and uncomfortable. I think at some level we realized that this was it. This was our support system for the next year. So whether we liked it or not, we needed each other. So either way, we tried to keep pushing through that initial kind of weirdness because we knew we needed each other. And so with that realization, that group became my traveling buddies, my comic relief, my sounding board, and the rocks that I could stand on throughout the year. And they were my first lesson in love. That instead of being an emotion that comes and goes, sometimes love can and should be a conscious and active decision. Now, it turns out that I would continue to learn that lesson every day just living in Rwanda. So many people remember or automatically associate Rwanda with the word genocide. So back in the spring of 1994, Rwanda was the site of a horrific genocide. One group of people tried to completely eliminate the other group of people. They had been neighbors. They spoke the same language. They worshiped in the same pews. But a long history of discrimination, division, hate propaganda, and an uninterested international community resulted in the brutal killing of over 1 million men, women, and children in just 100 days. Now, it's only been 22 years since all of this happened. Only 22 years since Rwanda has had to rebuild itself from the ground up. But in those short 22 years, Rwanda has established itself as one of the safest, cleanest, and most stable countries in Africa. I couldn't wrap my head around it. How was that possible? I think after living there for a year, I would argue that it's because of the conscious decision that the leadership and the people of Rwanda made. Every day they choose forgiveness. They choose reconciliation. They choose love. So now in Rwanda, instead of violence, you'll see whole neighborhoods of homes that were built by genocide perpetrators for genocide survivors. Instead of hate speech, you'll find local organizations and churches whose sole mission is to foster dialogue between those who killed and those whose families had been killed. If you go to any high school or university, you'll see student-run peace clubs. There are farming and art and business cooperatives that bring members of both sides of the conflict together for common goals. They've even stopped officially identifying as two separate groups, and instead there's an official slogan called Ndi Umunyarwanda, I am Rwandan. One great example of this was my local ice cream shop. So it was started by a women's drumming group that had formed after the genocide. A Rwandan theater director saw and noticed the deep emotional and psychological trauma that people were still living with. So she invited women in Butare to form this drum group as a means of self-expression and reconciliation. They became the first all-women's drumming group in the country, bringing together widows and orphans, wives and daughters of both perpetrators and victims to heal together using music and dance. The drumming group was so successful, they decided they wanted to do more. So they thought that they should create more jobs for women in the rebuilding country. And they decided that ice cream was a symbol of joy, and they wanted to build their business on that. So then they became the first locally operated ice cream shop in the country. And they became this symbol of hope, as they contributed both to emotional and the economic stability of the country. Now, there's no doubt that Rwanda is still healing. It will take much longer than 22 years to fully rebuild a country and for people to trust each other again. But I was privileged to witness the sheer determination with which people were trying to love their country back together. So making that choice, I think, is the first step, but it's not the last. You have to put it into action. Now, what first drew me to the Young Adults and Global Mission program was its philosophy called accompaniment. And this is defined as walking alongside global companions in a manner that practices mutuality, interdependence, and solidarity. So instead of trying to save anyone or fix something, we were encouraged not only to serve our communities, but to actually become a servant, just like Jesus did when he washed his disciples' feet. This philosophy really resonated with me, even though I wasn't really sure what it looked like in practice. But soon after I arrived at my work site, I very quickly learned what it meant in practice. So I thought I would be assisting with English classes at the Protestant Institute of Arts and Social Sciences. But back in 2009, Rwanda switched their language of instruction from French to English. So the university found out they were getting a free of charge native English speaker on campus, and they got excited. So I quickly found myself at the front of the classroom, sometimes in front of 100 students, sometimes for 6 hours in a day. And those were the days that I had to reach back to that idea of accompaniment, that idea of being a servant. And sometimes I would even find myself repeating, I am a servant, I am a servant, I am a servant. But on those days, I would try to also take a minute to look around at my class. Many of my classes were made up of working adults who were working full-time in addition to attending school full-time to earn their degree. Some students traveled an hour each way by bus just to get to the campus. Some students' entire schooling up to this point had been taught in French, but now they were required to complete the university curriculum in English. All of my students were studying things like education, peace building, theology, community development. So on those hard days, I looked to my students as examples of love in action. They were showing up every day. They were stretching themselves farther than I can imagine out of love for themselves, their families, and their country. So those thoughts, along with lots of strong Rwandan coffee, got me out of bed each day so that I could show up and put my love and respect for them into action through my teaching. Now, the last and maybe the hardest thing that Rwanda taught me about love was how to receive. And there's no better place to learn this lesson because the hospitality and the care of people in this country is staggering. Not only does it mean nonstop hugs and handshakes, it meant always being the guest of honor, being served first at meals, and always being taken care of. But as an independent-minded American, this took a little getting used to. I remember once I went with my fellow volunteer, Savannah, to visit one of her students, Esther. Esther is about our age, but was working to finish her high school education at Ramagana Lutheran School, where Savannah taught biology and music. On the weekends, Esther helped her mom sell fruit at the local market in Kayonza. So after meeting her at the bus station in her hometown, Esther immediately grabbed Savannah and I and guided us into a nearby restaurant. And she said, please, order some food and drink. Now in Rwanda, whoever does the inviting also does the paying. So Savannah and I were trying to be very conscious of Esther's financial situation and politely declined. We don't need anything, we're fine. But Esther seemed not to hear us. She just stared, waiting. The server stared, waiting. Savannah and I stared at each other, not sure what to do. So after some stuttering, Savannah and I each ordered a soda and decided to share a plate of French fries. We looked cautiously back at Esther, and now she was smiling, satisfied that we had fully accepted her invitation. But I remember feeling guilty. Those French fries and sodas had probably cost her more than she makes in a week. After our snack, we visited her family's home and met her father and siblings. Before we left there, her father heaped piles of fruit into our bags to take on the journey, with profuse thanks for coming to visit. I was reminded of the passage in the book of Matthew, chapter 25, "For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in." Not only do Rwandans live this, they take joy in it. So eventually, I stopped feeling guilty, and instead felt humbled and grateful. I stopped saying things like, no, please don't, or that's too much, or you don't have to do that. And I just started saying thank you. This radical hospitality taught me that love isn't just for Americans to give to Rwandans, or for white people to give to brown people, or for rich people to give to poor people. Love is a two-way street, and it takes courage and vulnerability to ask for help and to receive it with grace. And I couldn't help but notice the parallels between the amazing grace that I received and the amazing grace that Jesus poured out for all of us on the cross. Just like a Rwandan, Jesus did the inviting and the paying. So Butare Rwanda taught me a lot about love. But the best thing is that these lessons aren't just for people who move to Rwanda or for young adults in global mission. These are for all of us every day, especially now when it feels like there is so much fear and hate and division in our own country. My fellow volunteers and I were not the same. We challenged each other. We pushed each other's buttons sometimes. I bet you can think of at least a few people in your life that challenge you and push your buttons. What might happen, though, if we make the decision to love them anyway? What might happen if we remembered that we need each other? The people of Rwanda suffered unimaginable loss, heartbreak, betrayal, and violence. Our country has a history of loss, heartbreak, betrayal, and violence. But I would argue that there's a difference between our two countries' actions since then. Can you imagine if the US government sponsored an official campaign of peace and reconciliation like Rwanda's did? What might happen if we decided to intentionally foster dialogue between opposing groups? And what if we actually listened to each other? What might happen if our country decided to choose love and then put it into action? As a foreigner in a new place, I needed a lot of help from my host community. I didn't know the customs or where things were or how to speak the language. I needed help. I had to learn to stop saying, "No, I'm fine," and start saying, "Can you help me?" I had to let go of my American need to go it alone. I had to learn to receive. What might happen here if instead of trying to make our lives seem perfect and put together, we reached out and asked for help? What if we looked at receiving help the same way we look at giving help? I don't have the answers to these questions. But what I do know for sure is this, that God loves us so much, and he calls us to love one another. And that he doesn't put any strings on that call. He doesn't say to only love those who belong to the same political party, or only love those that look the same as you. God loved us so much that we also ought to love one another. And if we do this, God's love is perfected in us. Amen.